I'm Rich Sains, and you're listening to the Procurement Conversations Big Conversation. Join me as I talk to procurement leaders and industry specialists about the biggest issues facing our profession. Hi, and welcome to the Big Conversation. This week we're joined by Joël, Collin-Demers, the consulting principal of Pure Procurement. This week we're looking at the people side of procurement digital transformation, how we can put together the best team to help you achieve your objectives in the digital space. Joël, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Rich. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, good to talk. So, I guess the first question we had was how to define a ProcureTech implementation. I guess what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think before we jump into specific roles, how you would go about crafting your project team for a source to pay implementation or ProcureTech implementation, we want to be clear about what that means, right? So for me, it's well, first of all, I'm really happy to be having this two-way conversation with you. So it's a two-way interview, which is interesting. But to get into the topic, I define a ProcureTech implementation as implementing a solution or a module on the procurement value chain, right? So whether we're talking about spend analysis, spend management at the very beginning of the value chain, all the way through category management, sourcing, a contract lifecycle management platform, or getting into the purchasing side with procure to pay and accounts payable applications, supplier relationship management applications that give you that full view of the lifecycle of a vendor and what you have going on with them in terms of sourcing events, contracts, or even the day-to-day purchasing, and or vendor portal, vendor network implementations, right? So if you're implementing one of those solutions, one of those modules, or any combination thereof, I think that's how I would define a ProcureTech implementation. And I think in our initial chat, when we were discussing the questions, you brought this up where you said, okay, great, but we would also have stuff happening before that, right? Which is a prerequisite, which is you have a clear strategy before you start implementing this tech. So I think that's a clear distinction. What we want to talk about today is when you get into the implementation phase, but you probably shouldn't be starting with the implementation phase, right, Rich?
I think that's right, yeah. And I think it's any technology that supports the organization in the procurement of goods and services from suppliers. And I guess that's all the way along from the inception or the requisition that's formed all the way through to the payment from an operational point of view, and from intake, more strategic level, from intake to even the contract exit, I suppose. So there's all SRM, it's anything really to do from that point of view. And it's something that I think it's probably been done in the past. There's been many failed implementations of this sort of stuff. So it's what we're sort of passionate about getting this sort of stuff right now, aren't we? That's the big thing.
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's a specific set of skills that's needed, and a combination of skills that's needed to implement this without failure, or we should stay positive and be successful, right? So the second question that I would ask you is, how do you think about crafting a project team to implement one of these technologies? How do you make sure you're not forgetting key skills as you put together the people that'll help you be successful?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's one where I always say the technology really should be almost the last consideration. And I think with these key skills that we're looking for in people, it's that ability to affect change in people. So there's obviously a massive change management piece. There's making sure that we're considering the needs of the user, the needs of the stakeholders, the needs of the suppliers. So anyone in that sort of value chain system. And then, from a process point of view, you've got to have people who have a deep understanding of processes, ideally making those processes as lean as possible, as easy to understand as possible. We need to understand where the data is going, how it flows, making sure that we've got that data integrity really nailed. And then once we sort of considered those aspects from a skills point of view, there's also this technology piece. And that, to an extent, there's certain people in the demographics or age groups that are sort of more digitally native. So that's almost their first consideration when they're thinking about how to approach something. So, but that's not to say that obviously older people don't have some core digital skills as well. I don't want to get myself into hot water there. And I'm obviously a little bit older than some of the people in the population, but that's so I'd always say that triad of people, process, data, and then obviously the technical skills as well.
Okay, beautiful. Just to add on to what you're saying, like I would think of that, right, as I'm looking at the people I want to put on the team. I'd have physically 2 pages, right? The people I'm trying to put on the team in the different roles, and also making sure that I have that try out on another piece of paper and what that means in the context of my specific implementation, right? So if I'm implementing a sourcing module, for example, it means I need someone who knows the stakeholders very well within the business, and what key messages that would resonate with those folks, the culture of the organization around sourcing. I also need someone who's very good from a process standpoint, knows our procurement policy inside out for sourcing, how we execute sourcing on a day-to-day basis. That's not to mean we'll reproduce that in the new system or in the new processes, but we need to know where we're starting from very well. And then when we look at the tech and data side, it's who's familiar? Is it on our IT side? Is it somebody that's a super user on the business side? What about the data, right? Who's very good with where our supplier data is coming from, how it's being used in sourcing events, how it's being fed back into other processes, right? So having those three dimensions in mind as you're crafting that project team and making sure you're checking the boxes on the three dimensions, or I think call them the 3+1 dimensions with data, right? People, process, technology, and data. I think that would allow you to put a good project team together.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. And I suppose in terms of the project team, we're also thinking more widely. So there's a strategic element as well, and the sponsorship of the activity. I guess I don't know if you got any thoughts on what makes a good project sponsor.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. We could start at the top, work our way down the project structure, right? So a project sponsor to me, and it ties back to what we were saying at the outset, would have a clear strategy before putting a team together, mandating a team to implement this sort of ProcureTech. So they have that wider vision of where that specific piece, let's take our sourcing example, right? Where the sourcing module fits into the wider picture, around a good comprehension of the procurement policy, how we're trying to achieve compliance with that policy and the category strategies that we have in place. And then how does the specific piece we're putting in fit into that? What are the things that are non-negotiable for us to be able to reach our objectives as a business with what we're trying to do with procurement, right? Because if you're implementing tech, to me, you're trying to develop a business capability. And those business capabilities tie back to specific objectives that you have as a procurement organization that tie up into the wider business objectives, right? So being conscious around, what are those non-negotiables? What are the nice to haves? Because in these implementations, there's always questions of trade-offs and those hard decisions that are going to come back up to you in a steering committee type meeting will inevitably require a trade-off, a decision between what's a priority or what's more important than something else, even though everything is important. So there's that notion. And then the second piece is someone who's very strong as well at governance, right? Just putting a governance model in place for a project, right? So, and if not, getting the help to do that. So making sure you have the proper cadences of meetings to be able to know what's going on and see if the team is going off path and bring them back on path. And then, how the rest of the project is structured as well, right? Who are the key stakeholders that you want to have at those different levels of governance, whether it be a steering committee meeting, a project status, or a daily stand-up, for example, if I keep it simple. So I'd say, that's kind of the mix of skills that I would see a good ProcureTech project sponsor having. I don't know if you see anything else, Rich.
I think they've got to be fairly tenacious, because the priorities within organizations, there's obviously a lot of digital transformation going on within most organizations, usually at the coalface, customer facing type digital transformation, organizational wide, so things like sales and marketing. And sometimes those initiatives are the ones that really can suck in all the resources and the strategic imperative of the organization. And actually procurement, we need to be making the case for this is why it's worthwhile to making the change in procurement. This is the resources that we need. This is why this should be prioritized within the limited resource that most IT functions have. And so sponsors need to be fairly tenacious to get out there, get that visibility, get that resource, and get on with the job. And as we said, very strategic. You've got to be thinking a number of steps ahead. You've got to be thinking about a roadmap that works for procurement maybe 3 to 5 years out, and then how we take the building blocks to get to that position over a period of time. Because it's no longer the sort of thing that you can say, right, we're going to do one big suite and in 12 to 18 months' time, we've solved all our problems and we don't have to worry for another 5 to 10 years. It's not like that anymore.
That's a great point. So a good salesman, and you made me think that there should also only be one project sponsor, right? If you're thinking of going ahead in a project with multiple sponsors like that, I've seen that derail quite a few projects as well. Because of that trade-off dynamic, right? Like if you're doing a P2P implementation, there's going to be trade-offs between accounts payable and purchasing or procurement. And if there's no sponsor that's going to, take that hard decision, then the wheels can spin for a long time.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I'd agree with that.
So that brings us to the next role in the project hierarchy, which would be the project manager, right? So Rich, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on what makes a good ProcureTech implementation project manager.
For me, it's all about the soft skills. It's about the communication. It's about the influencing. It's about obviously coming up with a plan, but then sticking to it, or communicating where you're sort of blocked, or where there's a change to that plan. Increasingly, we're working in a more agile fashion. So there's obviously those agile skills that come into it, working closely with the sponsor to make sure that the senior stakeholders are briefed on what's going on. And as I say, any sort of issues that come up are solved along the way. There's always a bit of a question as to whether they need to understand the technical side of things. They have to have a certain amount of technical knowledge, but I think they don't need to be necessarily in the weeds on things, because their role is a little bit more strategic, more about the planning. But yeah, they have to have a bit of an understanding of the technical side.
And I would almost say I'd rather have a project manager who has a lot of procurement process experience versus procurement tech experience, because that red flag will come up if the tech design is going in a direction that doesn't match with best practice procurement processes. So I kind of rank those that way, right? Where I'd say you want a good project manager overall, right? Regardless of their functional background or functional experience. And if I can choose to layer something on top of that, it'll be procurement process experience. So if they've been a category manager in the past, or if they worked in IT and they were an IT business partner for procurement, for example, those are things I would look for. And then if they've been a functional lead or a functional analyst for a ProcureTech implementation in the past, then that's the cherry on top.
Yeah. And I think, they clearly need to be able to prioritize extremely well as well. As we say, it's not that you're doing one piece of work and you're just implementing something. There will be cross dependencies. There will be elements that you've got to get in the right order, otherwise they're going to end up blocking you. So being able to prioritize and say, right, this is what we need to do here, and actually this piece might be working parallel, but if we've got to bring it together at a certain point in time, I think that's obviously key. And that could also involve outside of their world. So it might be that there's a cross dependency on another business program that's going on. So you've got to be talking to all the other project managers and making sure that prioritization is happening there as well. What makes a good ProcureTech implementation functional lead or team lead, and how many do you need?
It kind of fits in nicely with what we were discussing around the project manager, right? Where to me, you're going to want as many functional leads as you are implementing modules. So if you're implementing a sourcing module and a contract lifecycle management module at the same time, well, I'd want 2 functional leads there, right? One that's going to concentrate, get up and go to bed every day thinking about their specific process area, and then the integration with the other. I try to always put the project as small as possible from a scope perspective that's viable. So if I had the choice, I wouldn't implement those 2 modules at the same time, but sometimes constraints make it so that, you are implementing multiple modules at the same time. So I just thought it'd be interesting or important to mention that. So I'd have one per module, per functional area where we're implementing a tool. And then what makes a good functional lead to me is having a good balance between those process skills, those functional skills from a procurement standpoint. So understanding or having experience with the actual processes, business processes that you're implementing. So if it was in sourcing, maybe I've run RFX events in the past, or maybe I've implemented such a solution in the past as well, and had exposure to the processes. So I'm able to master the process aspect of things, process modeling, doing process workshops where I'm able to bring stakeholders together and walk them through a process, capturing the inputs from everybody and being able to put that end-to-end picture together of both the as-is process, but also the to-be processes. And then the IT skill set as well, right? So maybe I've implemented or I've wrote functional specs for developments in the past. Maybe I've coded even a little bit. I know how interfaces work, right? I've implemented interfaces between systems. So those are kind of the things I would look for from a technical standpoint for a functional lead, to be able to say, okay, they've got a really good package or experience behind them to be able to be successful. Is really bringing those two aspects together, right? And then cherries on top are, have I dealt with data governance processes, data quality and conversion processes as well. And if I'm a good people person as well, then that's going to facilitate change management. But since we can bring other folks to the project to help us fill in those gaps, I put those as cherries on top of the functional lead sundae, so to speak.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, and I guess these are key roles in an organization. If they don't have these sort of skills, what can they do in order to bring those skills in?
Yeah, well, it's finding people like us, I suppose, right? Being able to go find people who have implemented these sorts of solutions in the past. Functional lead is going to be really more, I want them to have experience on the actual solution that we're putting in. So if I'm putting in an Ariba, Coupa, Jagger, and I want somebody who's done that exact solution in the past, right? So sometimes you could go directly to the software vendor, get functional and technical leads, or firms, right, as well, whether you're going to a big firm and they're helping you put together a project team based on what we're discussing, or going out and picking individual consultants, solo consultants that have done this in the past as well, right? So for me, the functional lead is really somebody who has experience with that specific solution. Whereas if you wanted functional experience for someone who's going to help you make it all fit with everything else, that's more of a business analyst profile, right? So maybe they've had experience with multiple different solutions like this and fitting them together and putting together an integration roadmap and essentially playing the role of an integration lead, right?
I suppose that's the key thing, isn't it? Is that the understanding and the experience of having done something like this in the past, or actually done this specific thing in the past, is really important. They need to understand where all the gotchas are in terms of the technical piece. Actually, the knowledge of the client environment is less important in this one, because they will have had to come in the past and learn this is how it's done. And I suppose to an extent challenge as well, because organizations, they do work very, very differently, especially in this area. But actually, when you're using a piece of off-the-shelf software, it needs to be a fairly standard approach really that you're implementing there.
Yeah, you want to bend the process to the software as much as possible, right? Because that'll be the least expensive way to go about the total cost of the life cycle of the solution. So absolutely, right. But you raise an interesting point, which is, not having that experience with the business, which sort of leads to another role we often see, and to me is essential in project teams, which is the subject matter expert, right? How would you define the role of a subject matter expert in one of these projects, and what would make a good one in your opinion, Rich?
One of the key things for a subject matter expert within the organization, they have to care. They have to feel passionate about their area. That's one of the things I always find when you bring in a subject matter expert. They're very passionate about their particular area of expertise, which I love. They will know all the issues, and they might know, when you talk to them, often they'll have been in this area for sort of 5 to 10 years, and they'll say, they'll know when they've tried to do something in the past, what's worked, what hasn't worked. As I say, just passionate and have an incredible knowledge and understanding about a particular business area.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, because as soon as you said that, like key or good SMEs that I've worked with in the past just like popped up in my head, right?
Yeah.
Of like being passionate and also caring about how the work gets done, right? And the rigor behind the work, the quality of the work, and just being passionate about that. And then, of course, in the context of that company, they're difficult to find, right? Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, it is. And I suppose the other thing you've got to add to it is as well, they can't have too much of a fixed mindset, because actually you are going through a piece of organizational change. So sometimes SMEs, that passion sort of goes into reticence to change, and actually that, you don't want that either. It's quite a difficult role. You sort of sit in the middle on quite a lot of things, and sometimes sit on the fence, but obviously as well then be able to make decisions about the way that things should go as well. So yeah, it's definitely a difficult one to get a good SME in there.
And I was gonna add that it's an excellent point you make around being mandated and feeling the ability and the ownership to take those calls around how things are going to work in the future, right? And maybe yes, you need to go back to the sponsor or you need to go back to the business to get certain inputs, but ultimately, as a subject matter expert, you need to feel empowered that you have that power to make decisions on, key decisions on the module on behalf of the business going forward, right? So I would say that's another piece as well, right? You want somebody who's able to take decisions and defend them and feel comfortable with taking decisions, and that the rest of the organization, so the project manager, the sponsor, are making it clear that that person has that responsibility, has that ownership.
So next question was around the ProcureTech implementation technical lead. How many do you need of these people?
Yeah, usually there'll be just one technical lead, right? Regardless of how many modules you're implementing, they might have folks on their team depending on the size of the work. But contrary to the functional standpoint, like it's more having a holistic view of what you're implementing from a technical standpoint, what the interfaces are, what the requirements of those interfaces are, and how everything fits together with the overall architecture of the business. So, we put technical lead here, but that's also, there's a bit of architecture, right? So you might have the same person that can do the two things, or you might have an architect and a technical lead that are different people. But there is that component of architecture, being able to make sure that it fits into a bigger whole from an IT standpoint, and then getting into the weeds on the interfaces and the details of how data is going to flow between the applications, linking up with security and how the roles are going to be managed. If you have central access management, there's specific technical configurations or single sign-on configurations, right? Making sure that fits in with the organizational standards as well. So just someone who's very well plugged into, what the standards of the organization are, and then is able to be symbiotic with the functional lead, right? So maybe they've already implemented procurement experience or procurement tech in the past. Ideally, as the functional lead should have implemented this specific product in the past, I would want my technical lead, if not the lead himself, somebody on the team, a technical analyst to have implemented this in the past as well, so that we can work through certain issues faster, right? Common issues faster, instead of being hung up on those common issues for that specific platform. So those are the sorts of things I would look for a technical team, right? Big picture stuff, being able to get down into the weeds, having experience on the specific product, and then building the team out with those requirements, right? And then considering as well, okay, do I have a functional lead that's strong technically? Does that give me a bit more leeway in terms of who I can put on this technical team, and vice versa as well, right? If you've got a technical team that's got functional experience, like I find those two play well off of each other.
So next role was around the implementation data lead. And this might be someone, I guess, in your IT team who really looks at the governance of data. But how would you define a good data lead for your program?
Yeah, so I think it'd be someone who ideally, has a more of a technical background, IT, but is very well versed in data governance processes, right? And is waking up and going to bed every day on your project thinking about, okay, how many pieces of data do we have? How are they going to be governed from a process standpoint going forward? Who is the data owner, the data stewards, not to get too technical in the terminology around master data governance, but and this might be your if you have a smaller implementation, you're not implementing a lot of different data elements. It might be your technical lead who might be taking on this responsibility, but on a bigger project where you have multiple pieces of data that it might come to be a full-time role or a dedicated role, and then making sure that the technical aspects, once they're implemented, the technical team kind of moves on. And they set up monitoring with support, IT support for your solution, but the data piece is a bit different, right? It goes to these data owners in the business. There's specific processes. Maybe you're using a ticketing system like a ServiceNow to get requests from the business to add new vendors or to change payment terms, or just to give a few examples. So to me, that data lead is really around, okay, what's the life cycle? A good data lead thinks about the life cycle of data and putting the processes in place to make sure that data remains high quality over time. When would you bring in change management lead or change management team to one of these implementations? To what degree, and what kind of skills would you look for and responsibilities would you look for in one of these ProcureTech implementations?
I'd bring them in pretty early on in the process, because I think it's always good for them to understand the level of change that's coming about. Look at the sort of the as-is processes, the to-be process, and they can see what the difference is then, and then obviously come up with a communications plan in order to make sure that at the right times, and ideally pretty regularly, communicating out the progress, communicating out what it means to the user. It's a really, really key role. You have to understand the sort of the human impact of technical change on individuals, and obviously understand that it means different things to different people. Some people are a bit more change resistant, some people are a bit more open to change. So how you communicate with different sort of populations within the workspace, organize all the training or whatever that's required for users, or communicating down to a super user population or whatever it is. Maybe some events that are going on. So yeah, they've got to be sort of fairly innovative. They've got to think a little bit differently in terms of this sort of stuff. So yeah, I think, as I say, key role, because lack of change management is always a key indicator of when something's going to go horribly wrong, and you're going to have poor adoption because you haven't considered the most fundamental aspect, which is the people.
Yeah. And I've seen it like very misunderstood over time. I don't know if this has been your experience, but I see the change management lead as essentially on par with the project manager in terms of, the governance structure of the project. And it's someone who, has taken the time to understand and segment the user population that's going to be affected by the project, and then integrate themselves into like the existing communication structures, right? Whether it be they have monthly operational cadences or like these events, as you mentioned, and how do we use those tribunes and then form out partnerships with our key stakeholders, key leaders in the business to be able to drive our key messages that we need to be successful. And then, as you say, identifying and meeting that resistance where it lies, and in innovative ways of being able to tear that down, whether it's a one-on-one conversation, whether it's taking a small segment on a specific activity to be able to do a demo, or see another site that's already implemented the solution, and really essentially ensuring the success of the project from a people dimension, right? Which I think you outlined. So it's very misunderstood. Sometimes I feel like people equate change management to sending out emails, a couple times to update on the project, and it's so much more than that, right? There's a whole methodology framework around applying change management. And so I would look for someone who has a good understanding of those frameworks and how to apply them as my change management lead, for sure.
Yeah, totally. I think and they have to understand, they have to really understand communications and really understand what people understand. So you don't want to be talking to people in the sort of the technical language of the program. You need to be talking to them in the simple language of the business. I don't mean to say that in a sort of a derogatory way, but it is a more simple language that should be used to communicate these changes to people, because the technical stuff generally does go over people's head, or they've got so much stuff going on in their day to day that they haven't got the mental energy to sort of really focus on something. And I think the point you made there as well about whether there's sort of existing communication forums or methods that are being used, you've got to get the balance right again. You can't be over communicating, because people just then switch off and think, well, I'm not particularly interested in this. You want to sort of slip it in with something that people may be receiving anyway, but at the same time, you want to make it stand out from everything else that's going on, and make sure that people read it and understand it and take the action that you want them to take off the back of it.
Yeah, it's finding that balance, right?
Balance in all things.
Yeah. And I think that like those are probably the main roles in that triad that we mentioned at the outset, right? Like the people process with change management, the process with your subject matter expert, your functional lead. On the technical side, or the technology and data piece, you'd have that integration lead and the data lead and your architecture team. Are there any other roles that you see that you would add, or depending on the project, the scope of the project?
I mean, yeah, there's lots on there. I suppose it depends largely on what it is you're doing. When you're working with suppliers, you've obviously got supplier enablement leads, and so some of the roles will be, potentially a bit more operational, a bit more admin, just pushing communications out to vendors to say this is what's coming up, this is the action you need to take. You've obviously got, I guess, more technical roles. You've got things like integrations that may be managed within your IT team. You might have an integration lead seconded across. Testing, obviously, you want to make sure that people are testing, and ideally, you want either super users or members of the user population to be testing there as well. But you might get some of those involved in the program for a certain amount of time, as well as there's obviously the sort of the IT testing as well that goes on amongst all this. You might even be working directly with some developers. So it's there could be many. I don't know if there are others that you.
To me, it depends on the scope of the project, right? So if you've got a very small scope, like a lot of these sub roles that we mentioned can be taken on by the functional team, or the technical team. But yeah, I would add, a project control officer, so like a PCO, if your project manager has a lot of reporting to maintain. Business analyst, we kind of mentioned or alluded to a bit earlier. You mentioned security as well. So like security lead around designing the security roles and how those fit in with the wider roles within the organization and in other applications. So those are things that I've seen on bigger projects. And then, if it's a smaller project, then, it might be your functional lead and technical lead that need to, submit or design the security roles according to certain guidelines by the organization, right? So I've seen it contract and expand based on the scope of the project, right? If you have a couple thousand suppliers to get to, then it might not be realistic for your functional team to do the supplier enablement piece. So you might have, 1, 2, 3 people dedicated to supplier enablement. So it really depends on scope. And I think that kind of wraps it up nicely, which is, it goes back to one of the key messages we were discussing at the outset, which is try to keep it as small as possible, right? So if you're starting to have a dozen, 15, 20 people on your project team, your scope's probably too big.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you've got to keep it fairly tight, haven't you? Otherwise, it does become a little bit, seems like a big committee, and the danger when you have too many people on a project is everyone thinks someone else is doing something, and then you don't take the action you need. I think I've always found having quite a tight project team, ideally 4 or 5 people max, just to make sure this stuff comes together and the action's taken. And as you say, if you're having a daily stand up every day, there's progress being made. And so the leads, the different roles we talked about, it might be that actually one person sort of undertaking a couple of those roles potentially as part of your program. But then for the smaller ones, where you're bringing together some configurable package software, it might be that you only really need 2 or 3 people, and you're making the progress you need to. So it's horses for courses.
I like it. So I think that kind of puts a nice bow on it. To be honest, it's probably one of the first time I've done a 2-way interview where we throw the ball back and forth. And
it's a bit strange, isn't it? But yeah,
but it went pretty well.
Yeah, no, it's good. I'm used to being the one that asks the questions, so you got to think on your feet a bit. It's a bit easier when you just ask a question and then run away.
That's right. But thanks for collaborating, Rich. I really enjoyed it, and I hope it's brought value to your listeners.
Thanks for listening. Do like and share and subscribe to hear the next procurement conversation.